Chris Keeper, Aware's VP of Client Delivery. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
We're seeing a lot of clients come to us with an initial approach for taking on web globalization. What's the most common, kind of initial approach that we're seeing? And what's the typical advice or the typical set of recommendations that we find ourselves giving these companies?
Absolutely. We're seeing a lot of companies approach globalization from a pure translation perspective. And so what I mean by that is not really taking time to consider the user experience or the content strategy, but diving right into the need to have content translated into however many languages they're targeting. And while translation is very important, it's a really critical element of a global strategy, it's not the only element that you need to consider. And in fact, if you only focus on translation, you're going to miss some really key things that will, in the end, cause you to be very ill prepared. So I want to point out just some of the things that we give for recommendations to our clients around a global strategy, and hopefully you'll see in the end how these really do go hand in hand with a solid translation approach. So the first thing is really enabling the user to find their desired content, and that is what's known as a global gateway, and it's typically a very distinct user interface, a graphical interface that enables a user to choose a locale. And a locale is typically content that's identified by a location of a region or a country, as well as a translation, and those two go hand in hand and get married at that point. And so it enables the user to have a choice. How do they want to digest that content? They might not always want to see it in a particular language, even if that language is their native tongue. And there's all kinds of reasons why that could be the case. And you think about some of the European countries where people live right on the border of France and Germany, and they may be bilingual, but they may have a very particular need for content in French instead of German, even if they live on the German side. So you don't ever want to make assumptions about that user experience. So that's a really key, big consideration. Another one that we talk a lot about is a content strategy. And that comes down into things like business considerations around product availability. It also comes down into, again, the assumptions of what information a particular user group is going to need access to. So for instance, we have a client who has a sales team in India, and through the course of our content strategy with them, we learned that the sales team interacts primarily with customers that speak English, not Hindi, which is one of the common languages in India. So rather than create an India Hindi site, we knew we could create an India English site. But that doesn't mean we're going to create a replica of the United States English site, because they're very different products and very different services that are done over in the country of India. So again, don't make assumptions. Make sure you're very close with what your content needs to be on a market-by-market basis. Another example is just from the pure sense of one-offs. So when you talk about translation, a lot of companies assume it's going to be a word-for-word or phrase-by-phrase, and they often call it a mirroring of translation. And it's typically not like that, and that can serve as a big surprise to companies along the way. So consider a lead generation form, or most often a contact us form. When you even cross from the US into Canada, you have to deal with things, the difference between a postal code and a zip code, or a province and a state. And so whenever you have a one-off in the sense of a form or anything related to marketing, promotions, graphics, customizations of logic, you really start to create some complexities on the back end, and you start to need to separate out your instances of these various global sites. So you want to be thinking about that well before you do any translation, because you don't want to over-translate or under-translate content that you don't need, because let's face it, translation is not cheap. Even if you have staff that can handle it for you, it's still manpower. So I really enjoy this process of, it's not just translation, it's also localization. And so everything we've been talking about today in this video interview is really kind of honing in on what localization is all about. And it's creating that user experience where they feel, no matter where they are in the globe, that your site was tailored to their needs. And so we like to talk about web globalization in the sense of usability on a global scale. So today I actually saw a webinar headline come across my email that was titled Translation Localization Process. So you can see how the two very much go hand in hand, and that's generally our recommendation to companies is don't look at translation alone in a silo, but remember to consider all the aspects of localization and how they impact one another. So keep that in mind and you'll be well off onto a good start.
Great. Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.